Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining our Speaking of Schools, a conversation about America's voucher politics. I'm Sharon Kirsch. I'm a co-founder and the director of research of Save Our Schools Arizona. And for those of you who don't know, we are a statewide grassroots nonprofit dedicated to community engagement and outreach and conversations like we're going to have today, all around the importance of supporting public education in Arizona. So I'm really honored to introduce our guest today. We have Dr. Ursula Hackett, who is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of London. And Dr. Hackett's research examines American political development, federalism, public policy making, education, religion, and politics. So we are here today to discuss her book that you see behind her there, America's Voucher Politics: How Elites Learned to Hide the State. This was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press, and her book is a winner of the American Political Science Association 2021 Education Policy and Politics Best Book Award, which is a great honor. So Dr. Hackett, welcome. We appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks so much.
So as you know, and as our guests watching today know, Save Our Schools Arizona is an organization that really formed specifically to fight voucher expansion in 2017, what we call in Arizona empowerment scholarship accounts. Other states in the country call them education savings accounts, but in Arizona in 2017, this would have been the nation's first universal voucher program. And so along with thousands of volunteers across the state, we successfully referred that bill to the 2018 ballot. It became Proposition 305, where voters overwhelmingly shot down ESA voucher expansion by a 2-to-1 margin. So that is to say, we have been on the ground, on the front lines in this fight. And we're so thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you to better understand the really rapid growth of vouchers across the United States, and to understand how and why the elites, as you call them, the policymakers, those who develop this pro-voucher policy, how they attempt to hide what they're doing and hide the role of the state when the state dollars go, when public funding goes to these programs. So I want to just start with how in the world did you ever become interested in something that many of us in Arizona think about every single day, and that is voucher politics in America? How did you come to that?
Okay, thanks so much, Sharon. Well, I'm really happy to be here to talk with you. I think it comes from a number of different directions. I've always been interested in researching American politics. I spent a lot of my formative years at Oxford at the Rothermere American Institute, which is the sort of foremost place for the study of American politics outside the US. So I came into contact with lots of really brilliant scholars of American politics, and that was how I came there. But I've also always had an interest in education politics, and the question that really engaged me for my postdoctoral research and beyond was to think about this really rapid expansion in the number of private school choice programs across the country. And I use the term vouchers here as a sort of shorthand for any form of program that offers public money to parents to spend on private education. So as you say, that sort of empowerment or educational scholarship accounts, tax credit voucher programs, and what I think of as regular voucher programs as well. So I'm sort of thinking about those all under this banner of voucher politics. And I sort of see this extraordinarily rapid and recent expansion. And it's sort of thinking, well, how did that come about? Because these programs face considerable obstacles, legal obstacles to their expansion, whether questions of religious establishment under the First Amendment, or perhaps also under state constitutions. Of course, Arizona's got a no aid provision in the state constitution. But also in the earliest iterations of those programs, there were questions about racial discrimination and equal protection, which maybe we'll come to as part of our conversations.
Yes.
And then, of course, more recently, the questions about public education and educational adequacy as well, and uniformity, and under the terms of every state constitution has got some sort of publicness to their education the education provision. And it's on that basis also that these programs are litigated around the country. So the question that sort of really engaged me from the beginning here was, well, how is it that these programs have achieved such rapid expansion, even in the teeth of not only political difficulties, but also legal entanglements of these various sorts? And the answer that I propose is that it's because legislators have been extremely successful and strategic in insulating those programs from that legal challenge by using strategic communication strategies, but also certain types of special policy design as well.
So help us understand a little bit who exactly these elites are. You've referred to them a little bit, and then give us some examples of how they hide the state.
Right. So I'm primarily, most of the people that I was speaking to for this project were state legislators, but I was also talking to a whole constellation of people who are advocating against and also for vouchers. And that includes people who are involved in various think tanks, people who are involved in the litigation process, people who are involved in the process of advocating in more broadly, executive officials, legislative officials, even at one point religious officials as well, even at one point a cardinal. So that was a very interesting experience. But people who have been instrumental in advocating on behalf of these programs and then seeing them through, not only through the legislature, but then also subsequently in court litigating those programs. So that's what I mean. I'm talking in very broad terms about elites. But just how is it that they're going about doing this? Well, they're doing it through several means. First of all, on the communications front, they're very careful about how they talk about these programs. Of course, the term voucher, I was told by multiple people, different people, voucher's a dirty word, don't use that term. We're very careful. One of them said, she thought I was making a mistake. She said, well, when I first arrived here, I used the term voucher, but now I've learned that I'm not supposed to use that term. So we use the term scholarship. And there are various ways in which the framing is sort of calculated to try to achieve a degree of political support and also to prevent future challenges. But I think the most important thing is about the policy design. So I mentioned various different forms of voucher program. Now, of course, we think about a voucher, we might think about the sort of quintessential voucher as being one where you appropriate the money directly to spend, give that lump sum to the parent, and the parent can spend it on behalf of the child at the private school. It's a relatively simple connection there. But what the real expansion of vouchers has taken place because of a particular innovative policy design that Arizona has done so well, and that is the tax credit voucher program. So instead of appropriating the money directly to fund these programs, you deduct the taxation that you would otherwise collect on donations to these organizations called scholarship tuition organizations, which then administer the voucher program to the parent to spend on behalf of the child at the school. So it's this very attenuated chain between, on the one hand, the state, and on the other hand, the school at the other end, the beneficiary of those funds. And so that I think about it, I'm calling it attenuated governance, this idea that you can achieve your objective in a direct way, but there might be advantages to achieving it in a more indirect way through these more complicated policy designs, particularly through tax expenditures.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I was testifying on a bill last week in the Senate it was the Ways and Means Committee, because they couldn't get the bill heard in the Education Committee. And always our legislators say, oh, they're not vouchers. Don't use the word voucher. So it's still very much considered a kind of dirty word, but that's what they are, especially in the most kind of umbrella term, because the term voucher does include the tax credit vouchers, the education scholarship accounts, and other vouchers that our schools use, especially for our special education kids. So it was Arizona that came up with the workaround that created the education savings accounts. So I might be getting my dates wrong, 2009, I think, we had a voucher program in Arizona where the money went directly to the school, And that was found to be unconstitutional because it was a violation of the separation of church and state. And so it was Arizona and the Goldwater Institute came up with the workaround to give the money to parents. And then the parent decides where that money goes. And that now, that law was passed in 2011, and those empowerment scholarship accounts went into effect in 2012. And in Arizona, when it first came to our legislators were promised that it was just a really small program. It was just a program for our special ed kids. It was just going to be about $1.5 million. And the argument was, well, look, we have some special ed kids whose needs are so highly specialized that the public schools, which actually educate many, many, many of our special ed kids, they can't for a certain number of kids. And therefore, we need to provide these families with money to find an education that will meet the needs of their children. And of course, what happened then is the next year, they said, well, now we need to expand this to foster kids. And then the next year, now we need to expand this to military kids, to kids in DNF schools, so each year it just grew and grew and grew and grew until now. We spend nearly $200 million every year just on empowerment scholarship account vouchers. So can you talk about that kind of pattern? Is that a pattern you see?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All of the things that you're saying are things that I've seen around the country. There were three different things that you're suggesting there that I think are part of this sort of strategic landscape. First of all, the use of the Ways and Means committees rather than the education committees. I mean, I've had that. I remember talking to lots of legislators and they're saying, well, I never get a good markup in education. I never have good luck over there. So I choose this other approach. I choose these other committees. I choose Ways and Means rather than education. That's another advantage that doing the tax expenditure route takes you, that you can sort of pitch it as a tax measure. And so that's one part of the strategic calculus, absolutely. But you're right, exactly. So I've done some experimental work as part of this research project that looks at people's understandings of the deservingness of different populations for those who might receive a voucher, and in particular those populations that are seen as most sympathetic, and thus it's sort of an easier haul to actually get those sorts of voucher programs over the line. So things like disabled kids, of course, for one, foster kids, military families sometimes, there are, and low-income kids as well, of course. So there's an interesting story there. But there are all these subpopulations where legislators feel, okay, so maybe we can't go for the universal voucher initially. Maybe we go for the subpopulation, and then later we build on that, and we that's our sort of the camel's nose under the tent type thing, and we're able to build on it. But I think also there's the question about the geographies of these programs. And I was thinking here about Louisiana. I mean, there's a very similar dynamic where initially Bobby Jindal says, right, let's New Orleans, this is going to be a program. I mean, they have this big shock. They have Katrina, and they have all of these, the school system quite literally physically in tatters. And there's this opportunity for those who are advocates of school choice to come in to that jurisdiction to say, look, we're going to be offering these vouchers, and the kids can to go to private schools. But then it expands a few years later to the whole of the state, and that is and there are people that had been who'd been supportive of the New Orleans effort that were then suddenly not very keen about the statewide effort. And it's quite that I think also some quite revealing political dynamics there as well, about what happens when you try to expand these things, the geographies of these programs. So what you're suggesting, I think, is absolutely replicated as I see it around the country, that those are often some of the ways in which these programs achieve political success.
Yeah. So in your first chapter, you talk about America's foundational identity struggles. And so the battles that our country, that our nation has had since our inception. Walk us through that, help us kind of understand this and what's at stake in these struggles and how it connects to vouchers.
Okay, thanks. So this is the absolute broadest brush possible historical kind of sensibility. So forgive me, but I think it really the case of vouchers is a brilliant case study of the sort of intersection of various battles that have taken place right since the founding of the United States about what America is and what America should be. Just sort of really foundational identity. What is this nation? Who are we? And so on. And I think that those battles take various different forms. There is a religious struggle, which I think you can see right from the founding era, right up until the present day, between those who advocate, on the one hand, a secular vision of the United States, that is a place of a strict separation of church and state. And you see that in Jefferson, of course, and that comes down to the present day. But also there's an accommodationist vision. There's sort of the legacy of Puritanism, the sense that this is a godly country, that God's purposes should animate public policy and government. And so those competing visions about what America is, I think, neither fully wins out at any point, but you have these periods of time where one or the other is in the ascendant. And you can sort of track that over time. There's also, of course, America is the site of a racial struggle, not only a religious struggle, but a racial one, a struggle between those on the one hand who seek to erect racial hierarchies of various sorts, and then those on the other hand who've sought to demolish them at different points. And again, we can see how those have played out over this very, very long historical trajectory. And then there's a third struggle, which I'm thinking about as a sort of public-private struggle between those who think that, government should keep out of individuals' lives, and sort of individuals should be free as far as possible from an overweening state, versus those who, on the contrary, think, and again, you can trace this back to founding thought, that government should build civic institutions for the collective good. And so you can see those two traditions in play throughout American history and politics, and sort of structuring political competition. And the reason why I have this very, very broad brush perspective is because I think the really interesting dynamic comes about when, after a period of ascendance, then one side in these big racial, religious, public-private struggles comes to see themselves slipping, that they feel that the other side is gaining some degree of legitimacy within the institutions of the state. So, for instance, what exactly do white supremacists do in the dying days of Jim Crow in the 1950s and into the early 1960s, where they're thinking, right, well, we're starting to see racial egalitarian ideas coming to prominence in the federal government and being enforced, and what are we going to do? Well, we can defy, which of course many jurisdictions do, or we can seek indirect ways to achieve those very same aims. So, for instance, we can privatize our white primary to say, well, no, it's not a state. It's not. This isn't government action. This isn't the state government. This is private parties. So you can't enforce those sort of discrimination, the law against discrimination in those circumstances. We can privatize our recreational facilities. We can privatize our parks and our swimming pools in an effort to try to prevent the desegregation. And you see exactly the same dynamic when it comes to tuition grant vouchers, which were amongst the first iterations of voucher programs that were created by a number of Southern regimes in the 1950s and 1960s to enable white families to escape desegregation of the public schooling system. So there are various, I would say that it's at that moment where you fear you're going to lose in court, because your ideas are sort of losing what legitimacy they might have had, or that they might have what power they might have had, that you start to turn towards these sort of creative, strategic approaches. I mean, it's not just conservatives who've used these sorts of approaches. I mean, think about the racial egalitarians who, during the 1980s, if you see the period, this sort of backlash against civil rights, you've got a sort of era of the sort of stigma of in public housing, for instance, in sort of the sense that you would it might be better to provide a housing voucher to individuals to go and spend in the private marketplaces rather than subsidizing the public housing projects directly. And so you try to achieve your aims indirectly. You can still try and help, low income African Americans, which might be one of your sort of core goals, but you can do so in a way that doesn't attract the same degree of opposition, one would hope, than if you achieved your aims directly. So I'd say that it can work on both sides, but it's at that tipping point where you find yourself, oh gosh, we're really struggling here. What can we do? Well, that's where you turn to these creative approaches.
Yeah. So many things I want to ask. Not right now, but I'm going to sort of bracket for a second. Are we getting close to a tipping point? Because on the ground in Arizona, it feels very, very challenging, because it seems as if those who are pushing to privatize our public schools, and they do it for different reasons here, like you said, there is definitely a push, a kind of libertarian push to the market is going to be the best approach. If we turn this all over to the free market, then the good schools will kind of percolate to the top and the bad schools will fall out and everything will be great. We feel in Save Our Schools that we don't want there to be winners and losers, right? We believe that public education is the cornerstone of American democracy, and that's part of the responsibility of the state as it's laid out in our Constitution, which says that the legislature is responsible for providing a general and uniform public school system. And so that kind of begs the question then of, well, what's general and uniform? And it's difficult because we have people really now in particular pushing parents' rights and saying, well, the public schools, they're bad. They're government schools. They're failing schools. They frame, use that sort of rhetoric. They're failing schools or government schools. And therefore, as a parent, I need to make a decision to take my kid out. And they don't say the state should pay for that directly, but the expectation is that they would get a voucher to do that. And so I think we really feel that tension between what our legislature should be doing, what they're constitutionally obligated to do, and what's actually happening in Arizona. We have the lowest per pupil funding in the country, even though some of our legislators just this week tried to claim astronomical figures for per pupil spending. But any data that we look at, any study that we find shows us, especially when you're just looking at the portion that the state gives to each child, is 50th in the nation. Our teachers are paid, so they're also last or 49th or 48th in the country. And I think to me, the most challenging thing that our state faces is we have between 25 and 35% of our classrooms don't have a teacher. They have at best a temporary, sometimes a long-term sub, sometimes different subs each week. And we don't have a pipeline of teachers signing up to be, taking over in these classrooms. We also don't have a lot of certified teachers. And so I guess my question is, if we accept that our states in the United States are constitutionally obligated to provide a public education system for the citizens of their state, then how do we, as really just individuals, push our legislatures or our leaders to fulfill that constitutional obligation and to recognize it as a public good and not just say, okay, we'll turn the money over to the parents and they can take it wherever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I think this is absolutely the conversation that's happening around the country. And I mean, it's something that it's a fight that has been taken up largely by teacher unions in the courts. I mean, they're the ones who've been really representing that sort of communitarian vision of American civic life and of education in particular, and thinking, right, there is, as you say, there is an obligation. It varies in terms of different US state constitutions have different language, but something like, general, public, open, efficient, uniform, adequate education, that is a constitutional responsibility of the state legislature to provide that public education. And it's formed the basis of litigation. It's been formed the basis of successful litigation in various places as well, that they've been able to say, this is that if you are providing vouchers for private education, then you are violating that responsibility, your constitutional responsibility to provide public, a uniform public education. I think that the difficulty, there are a number of difficulties here, one of which is that teacher unions are are sort of on the back foot in that they are has been financially damaged in recent years by reduction in membership. They've been hit by the Janus case in 2018 that meant that they couldn't levy agency fees. They've been, obviously, in lots of places like Arizona, we're talking right to work states here, and of course school choice legislation often comes hand in hand with right to work legislation around the country, or has been historically, time-wise. So there are all sorts of challenges that those who seek to oppose these programs in court on the basis of the public education provisions and state constitutions that they face. So there are a lot of challenges there. But I think that the broader problem for those who want to advocate in court on the basis of the public education provisions in state constitutions in opposition to vouchers is that your success in making that case hinges crucially upon the extent to which the judges are persuaded of the validity of tax expenditure analysis. And the reason that sounds rather a convoluted thing, but just that if you accept that targeted, as Alan Kagan said in Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization versus Wynn, that 2011 case, yes, the big landmark in which the Supreme Court held that the tax credit scholarship was constitutional. You mentioned that before. So Kagan, in her dissent, said, well, targeted tax breaks and direct cash grants are basically the same, they're means of achieving the same objective. So that was the principle of the liberal minority in that case. But the majority says, well, these things are not the same. And that's the essence of what we understand by tax expenditure analysis. So there are those who are able to advocate persuasively in court, and it's persuasive, at least to the conservative majority there, that it is not equivalent to have a direct appropriation versus a tax credit scholarship, where you are providing a tax break for that particular purpose. So it's a live scholarly question, and it's a live intellectual question. So it's one that is playing out in the courts right now, as to whether judges believe that it's true or not. And that's the basis on which a lot of these cases are going to hinge, because if you are not able to say that targeted tax breaks are the same thing as ultimately equivalent in terms of their effects and their purpose to a direct appropriation, then you're not going to be able to make the argument in court that this is effectively defunding public education, right? Because what the advocates of these programs will say is that, no, this is private money. This is private money. I mean, you can trace that argument right back 70 odd years to the discussions about desegregation and the tuition grant vouchers, and the conversations are saying, well, no, it's private money. As soon as and there are those who say, well, if you're not being taxed on that particular, the money that you're offering, even if it's 100%, right? I mean, I know that at least one of your your corporate tax credit scholarship, they can get 100% back, right? So it's exactly, they're getting the funding.
All four of them.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, that is a situation where the money has come out of the state treasury in a sense, but it has never been collected. So, but it's exactly those sorts of arguments that are being made again and again. They're saying, well, this is private money. It's private action. We are using third parties' legitimate discretion to break the links between the state on the one hand and the whether that's a segregated school or a religious school or a private school more generally on the other. And on that basis, the program is held to be constitutional.
So then would it not matter then if 90+% of our tax credits, if we know that 90% plus of our tax credits go to religious schools? Like, is there a tipping point where you can come in and say, well, wait, now actually?
Well, I think that it's certainly the case is easier to make for those programs where it's a 100% deductibility, but I don't think there's a specific threshold. I think that actually the broader issue here is that so my book is really tracing the sort of course of political action and litigation on these cases over the last 70 odd years. And what I am really showing in this book is it's mostly about conservatives who were on the back foot in various ways, whether that's racial conservatives or whether we're thinking here about religious accommodationists who want to sort of find a way to support parochial education and are coming up against, after the Warren court's got these school prayer decisions, and it feels like it's a more sort of, the public schools might be a more hostile place for those who are really concerned about the religious education of their kids. So what can we do to support these religious schools? They are on the back foot because they come up against those who are arguing on the basis of the Establishment Clause that this is an unconstitutional violation of the separation of church and state. Yeah. And if you are providing funding to religious institutions, then you are violating the Establishment Clause. Of course, that comes to a head in 2002 with Zelman versus Simmons-Harris, which is the big US Supreme Court precedent that finds that in favor of the constitutionality of a program that had incorporated religious schools. And so the story that I'm telling is of the gradual building up of a secure legal cushion for those who want to support these programs, including those that incorporate religious schools. Now, we might come on to this in a moment, so I don't want to jump the gun, but the really interesting litigation now is not Establishment Clause jurisprudence, it's free exercise. And I'm sure you're following the Carson versus Mackin case, the big main case, where actually it's not about including religious schools, it's about excluding them from a program. And can you constitutionally do that? And of course we have Espinoza as well. I mean, these are moments where actually I think that those arguments, that there is precedent that supports and indeed constrains judges at both the federal and the state level to make a determination in these cases that has tended over time to become more favorable, become more favorable to these programs, including those that incorporate religious schools. And I think the next front, and it comes back to these tipping points that we both mentioned. I think the next front is actually the question of free exercise and whether any exclusion of a religious organization from these programs is going to run a cropper in the courts.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I want to go back a little bit to talk a little bit more about our foundational identity struggles, because I really do, that framework that you put forward in your book was really helpful to me to sort of understand the historical roots of what we're living in today. And I think race plays a particularly interesting role in this. As you have mentioned, part of the history of vouchers, really the initial history of vouchers, is when Milton Friedman wrote his essay defining them in 1950. I'm not a historian, Ursula, so you'll have to, 55, I think. Yeah. Oh yes, it was 55 because it was 1 year after Brown versus Board of Education. And then we know the case Griffin versus County School Board of Prince Edward County in 1964. And so basically we had a single county say, well, if you're going to force desegregation and you're going to force our white kids to go to school with our black kids, then we're going to just go to a full voucher system. And what happened
and shut the public schooling system entirely.
Yes. Yeah, they just shut them down. And so for 5 years, and they said, well, we're going to be fair and give a voucher to every family. But the problem was there were no there were no private schools that would accept African-American kids. And so while this case was caught up in the courts, there were about 5 years in which African-American families either had to educate their kids in a church basement or send their kids across a county line. And so I think the segregationist roots of vouchers and the racial roots of vouchers are very prevalent. And so the way that we're seeing this conversation take shape now is when the legislators in Arizona who are proposing further voucher expansion, and we have many, many bills moving through our legislature this session, they are calling vouchers the civil rights issue of our era. So have you heard that sort of that's, to us anyway, seems to have just popped up in the last couple of years. So I'm curious if you've seen that kind of framing.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting, and I've written quite a bit about this. And I think it's it is quite a complex story, the question of race and vouchers, because of course, as you say, the first iterations of these programs, segregation tuition grant vouchers, is explicitly designed to allow white parents to escape desegregation of the public schooling system. Some did go to black kids in some jurisdictions to go to private, again, segregated academies.
Yes.
But yeah, so it is overwhelmingly about for white families, and it takes a long time. So so they come in several waves. These segregationist tuition grant vouchers, places like Virginia, Louisiana, Georgia, they sort of get going on these things early in response to Brown v. Board, and they start to create they distribute quite a large number of these programs, these vouchers. But then later on, you get other southern states kind of getting in there as well and sort of starting to create their own programs in the 60s. But by 1970, they've been struck down as unconstitutional in every jurisdiction, these segregation vouchers. And that's because well, they're a transparent artifice to escape desegregation. I mean, you know, the judges remark upon this. They say, well, it's rather suspicious that these programs came into existence immediately after, private schools get created, and they charge exactly the tuition rate that is the voucher, and the judges have got these incredible statistical tables where they're saying, well, hang on a sec, let's compare these things. And also, of course, segregationists are not very good at hiding their purposes. I mean, they say, well, look, we're going to do this. This is to keep the schools segregated, and we're going to do it. And despite the brainwashers, the federal government, and the communists, I mean, they say this stuff openly, yes. And it's not. The judges remark upon this disjuncture between the sort of, in lots of ways, they've made efforts to try and create an attenuated policy design. They channel the money through parents, they channel the money through third-party organizations, yes, to the parents. So they're going the extra mile, and they're rewriting their legislation over and over again. I mean, Louisiana went back to the drawing board at least 4 times because they keep getting it struck down. So they're very tenacious, and they do this, but they don't. They don't hide what they're trying to do, so they're not really paying much attention to their sort of communication strategies, at least on this, with respect to the courts. So by 1970, they get struck down as unconstitutional. It's clearly an attempt to evade desegregation. So then you get this period for the next sort of 20 odd years or so, where there are a few scattered experiments with vouchers, but this sort of stigma, I think, that is attached to the voucher cause because of the segregationist origins of these programs really stymies a lot of efforts. But then in the 1990s, you get the big Ohioan effort, and you get the Wisconsin effort, you get Cleveland and Milwaukee. And these are programs that are actually created by African-American state legislators in lots of cases, and in order specifically to try to help poorer African-American kids who have been denied they feel have been denied the promise of public education, that they've been denied the promise of choice, that they are stuck in institutions that are failing them educationally, and that they are therefore in need of those options and urgently, and that they should have targeted help to allow them to escape those institutions for the private sector. So that's sort of the part of that conversation. You get very prominent legislators, people like Polly Williams in Milwaukee, who died a few years ago, but she was instrumental in getting the Wisconsin program over the line. But what's interesting, so that is it's a race conscious approach to voucher programs, and there are actually, I mean, public opinion is really interesting on this. We haven't talked about public opinion yet, but there is some indication that it depends very much on the framing, but African-American parents are kind of and Hispanic parents kind of often quite supportive of the idea of school choice, yes, in lots of ways. So quite interesting, but it does vary by opinion wording, by question wording. So there is this race conscious effort on behalf of vouchers. Then what happens if you fast forward another decade or so into the 2000s? The really big expansion of vouchers comes post 2010, and that's the Barack Obama's midterm shellacking. It's the moment where you get the Republicans gaining huge swaths of state legislatures across the country and starting to implement a whole range of conservative policies, including right to work, but also school choice in lots of places. And that's the moment where tax credit voucher programs take off, but also there's less of an emphasis on low income, urban kids that maybe those Ohio and Wisconsin programs have been, and people like Representative Williams, who had been this big supporter of vouchers back in the 1990s. She cools on it. She cools on the idea. She says, look, this is not what we intended to do. It's not being targeted to the kids that need it in these particular jurisdictions, and it's something that's that is corrosive. And so I think that's a big sea change again. So we've seen one shift in the years between the demise of the segregation tuition grants and the kind of race conscious approaches, but really in the modern sort of colorblind vision of these programs, I think it's taken another turn entirely, and it's one that has alienated some of the original race conscious support of these programs. There was an organization called the Black Alliance for Educational Options that you might have heard of. They folded in 2017, so they were really the only nationwide organization that was really advocating for these things on behalf of racial minorities. Mm-hmm. All civil rights organizations are, the NAACP and everything, they are opposed to these programs, and we've been opposed to them. So it is a complex story. There was this brief flowering of sort of efforts on behalf of low-income African Americans in particular, but I think that has been superseded by the modern wave of these programs, and the focus is not on helping Black kids to fulfill their educational potential.
Right. So let's talk a little about public opinion, because one of the things that we find in Arizona, every poll that's been done for years, people in Arizona say that education is one of their top, if not the top issue of importance to them. And when we were circulating petitions to get that voucher expansion bill on the ballot, we had people from all political parties. Arizona is about a third Republican, third Independent, third Democrat. Everybody signed it. Everybody said, no, we don't want to expand vouchers. We want strong public schools. And there's just so much data to indicate that that's the case, whether you're rural, whether you're urban, whether you're kids in a private school or public school, there's just widespread support for public education. But there's this disconnect because our legislature is full of people, particularly Republicans, but not all Republicans, who are not only supporting school choice and privatizing public education, but really actively pushing it and actively prioritizing it to a point where the majority of the bills we see in our legislature related to education are related to school choice. Nobody's trying to think about, well, how could we get Arizona from 49th to the middle of the pack for per pupil spending? Like, those conversations aren't happening here. So can you help us sort of understand that disconnect between the people on the ground and what's happening in the legislature or with the elites who are pushing these policies?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because the focus of my own of this research is on the elites, and really thinking about, okay, legislators really concerned about legal entanglements and how is this going to play out in court, because they're in a sort of anticipation of legal challenges. And so a lot of what they're thinking about is, okay, so how can we defend this down, how can we shore this up and insulate it from that future challenge? And I think that the lesser I say the lesser concern, but there is the concern which comes from the electoral concerns, right? The concern about, well, how is this going to play at home? And I think the trouble with this, so there's a huge scholarship on the sort of tax expenditures and the use of private mechanisms for the delivery of social policy, which is something that you guys do so well in the United States, or so extensively, shall I say. It's a very widespread phenomenon in the US, and it has a number of consequences. I'm exploring the legal consequences of the use of these private mechanisms for delivery of policy. And that is that it provides a sort of rationale in favor of the constitutionality of these programs that allows you to sort of, make the argument that it's not state or government action.
Right.
It allows you to sort of, so it has those legal benefits, and I can show how those have played out over time. But there's loads of cool work that's being done about the effect of the use of these private delivery mechanisms and tax expenditures on public opinion. And one thing we know about, there are a number of things that we know about this, they're very difficult to disentangle, right? It's hard to understand what is going on when policy is delivered in these really convoluted, indirect ways, and maybe you don't recognize that it's the government that's providing a particular benefit because it's channeled through a market participant in some way. I mean, it could be through a direct voucher payment, or it could be even more complicated as with these tax credit programs. People don't give government credit for the things that it does, and that is corrosive of democracy, frankly. I mean, there is a really broader conversation here about people. It's not that people are ignorant. People are actually, really quite willing to engage in these conversations, but it's just that the design of these policies and the ways in which they're presented to people is so complex, and people, it's not easy to join up the dots, basically, between what the government's doing and what is actually happening on the ground. And so I think there is a real challenge that comes from organizations like yours that are trying to do that and to join up the dots and to expose and to understand and to try to inform, because I think the informational requirements are large, that people really, you do have to do an awful lot of spade work to help people to understand what's at stake and to help them to understand exactly how these programs are being funded and where the money is going.
Yes. The other thing that we've been thinking a little bit about lately is the other piece that's kind of hidden is the actual financial cost to the state. So the ESA voucher program here, I'll start with the STO, with the tax credit voucher program. So we have school tuition organizations. So it's like cottage industry in Arizona. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of school tuition organizations. And that's where individuals and corporations can give their tax dollars that would have gone to the state of Arizona. They get it back 1-to-1 when they file their taxes. So it's a 1-to-1 tax credit. And then those organizations dole out the vouchers to different schools and kids. Now the organizations get to keep 10% of that money. And so it can be a very lucrative business. But that's what they get to administer handing out these vouchers to all these different schools. Now the state of Arizona is required, our Department of Revenue, I think, is required to certify or okay any school that receives these STO vouchers. And so that amount of money that's spent, that the state of Arizona spent, there's nothing like allocated for that. So there's a cost to the state that isn't sort of factored into all of this. There's a similar but more complicated story with ESAs. And we just had a conversation with one of our volunteers yesterday who works at a bank, and she said they get people who've just graduated high school to come in. They can have difficulty reading and writing at anything close to a professional level that would allow them even to be adequate employees. And so she was saying that's a cost to the state too, when you just don't have a basically educated population to move into just basic jobs in your state. So I'm not sure what I'm asking. Is there some way to sort of think about other hidden costs that that the elites are also maybe not, I don't know if they're actively hiding them, but they're certainly not acknowledging the other costs of not providing a general and uniform public school system?
There's a lot I take from what you've just said there, Sharon, because I think the one thing I know from my survey of the whole sort of ground, as it were, is that there is enormous variation in terms of the regulatory apparatus for private schools around the country. I mean, there's some of these programs, they barely count them. I mean, it's just the kids, and there are others that are sort of much more sort of serious about the kids have to take certain tests, and there's sort of regular check-ins. It's sort of, there are accreditation requirements for taking part in these programs. But interestingly, I mean, this maybe is a bit of a tangent, but I want to mention this here. I was thinking about travel all over the country, coast to coast, in the middle, everywhere, and talking to lots of different people, and performing lots of statistical analysis of votes around the country as well over a large period of time, to try to understand not only where vouchers are successful, but also where they're failing. And some of the interesting instances of failure are places like Missouri, although they've recently just passed on, but that was a long time in the coming. Places like Texas, actually, as well. You mentioned Texas in the beginning. I mean, kind of ruby red conservative states, some of them surrounded by voucher adopters, where you think, why the heck have they not got some sort of voucher program? And part of the part of the challenge, I think, for some of these legislators, Republican legislators who are trying to support the private school choice in these jurisdictions, is that they run up against really conservative opposition from the other side, right? Some of the opposite side, from the sort of the liberal and the union perspective, but saying, well, if you provide this voucher money to us, then that is going to come with regulatory apparatus, and we are concerned about any government interference with our private schools, and we don't want to accept any public money because we're concerned that it comes with regulation. And so they face opposition not only from the left but also from their rightward flank, and of course there's also questions there about rural legislators who are thinking, well, what's in this for me? And we talked about this before, but right. Certainly it's a tall order to get those on board as well. So so I think that's part of the story, but it's an interesting question about the sort of role of regulation with respect to these vouchers, and I think it's an interesting point to make about the funding and the capacity, the state capacity to actually achieve the regulation of these private schools. It's certainly something that unions have been very concerned about. Teachers unions have been very concerned about. If public money is going to these schools. Of course, what they're arguing in court is it's not public money because it's private money, because it comes through these tax expenditure mechanisms. But yes, I think the question of regulation is one, it's really patchy, but it has been the basis of opposition from the conservative side in certain states as well.
Well, and interestingly, in Arizona, our vouchers have zero, our ESA vouchers have literally zero regulation at all. And so that's one of so Save Our Schools isn't 100% opposed to vouchers. We want, of course, the needs of all of the kids met, especially kids with special needs. So we've never opposed the very first iteration of ESA vouchers in our states, but all in our state, but all the other ones, we have no idea, literally zero idea how any kid who receives a voucher does. We don't know academically how they do. We don't know anything. So not only, we're concerned about how those kids are doing and what it means for their future, but we're also concerned about now the 2 voucher programs in Arizona. It's now pushing $380 million. I mean, that's a lot of state money that's going to, we don't know. There's just no regulation that helps us understand if it's a good use of taxpayer money at all.
And the educational scholarship on all of this is that is still, the jury's out, on the sort of educational benefits or costs of taking part in a voucher program. I mean, some of it says, yes, there's an increase in 5th grade reading scores or 8th grade math, but sometimes it's less. And it's a very, my focus is not on the educational costs and benefits so much as the governance, the questions of governance and so on that these questions that these programs raise. But certainly there's no evidence of a sustained benefit for actually taking part in these programs. And I think it's pretty interesting. Even though, there are lots of organizations, institutes around the country that are in part at least funded by organizations that are advocating on behalf of these vouchers. I'm thinking like the Walton Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation. They've got a big inter-school choice demonstration project in Arkansas, and there's a whole load of these things around the country. But they're producing research that's suggesting, well, there are benefits, there are costs, and maybe it all comes out in the wash, and we don't know. But I think the thing that we certainly can say is that there are questions of regulation, there are questions of state funds, and there are constitutional questions. There are questions about discrimination and equal protection, and educational adequacy that I think do need to be paid attention to very seriously.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry to say we're running out of time. Just in our last few minutes, I guess I would ask any advice that you would have to our grassroots organization that believes in public education as a cornerstone of American democracy. Any advice that you would give us moving forward?
So I would say grassroots really matters. And actually there are instances, I think, I mean, the story that maybe I've been telling has been quite a pessimistic one, in that it is the story of the rise of these programs and the successes of the conservative organizations that are advocating on behalf of these programs. But I think there are instances where we've seen grassroots efforts to try to oppose these programs. I mean, we saw that in Utah, for example, in 2007, they got the thing off, and it has happened elsewhere as well. And I think communications are key. I think that the framing of this effort really matters. We've seen how over many years, organizations advocating on behalf of vouchers have become better at communicating about what they're doing in such a way to avoid arousing sort of opposition in different quarters. I think that same effort can be applied to those who oppose vouchers as well. I mean, certainly people love the idea of school choice. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you know, huge majorities in every category say like the idea of school choice, but then when you actually drill down to the specifics and you provide that information, you engage in that really painstaking informational effort, then you can move the needle in terms of public opinion. I think that joined up action is really key as well, because I think that one of the things that we can learn from those who are advocating on behalf of vouchers is they've been extraordinarily successful litigating across different jurisdictions, often at the same time, sharing expertise, sharing, providing that sort of the rationales and the justifications and the sort of the narrative that has dominated over the last few years. I think that's I mean, it costs a lot, but it's not just about money. I think it is also about that kind of the energy and about the enthusiasm and the sort of thinking, working together with other organizations around the country. I know that that's what you're doing, that you're actually doing that. You're not just balkanized within the state, but you're thinking about how these things are working across lots of different jurisdictions. And I think being very tenacious and vigilant, and that's something you're also doing very seriously, because these efforts take place again and again and again. I mentioned Missouri. Decades they were trying to do it. I mean, and it kept coming up and it kept failing, and they kept thinking, well, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that, but they kept going, and then they got it over the line. And so I think having that kind of just being very ultra vigilant about these programs as they're coming up, and of course you're completely plugged into what's happening. I think that's really important. But okay, so all of those things I think are important, but the broader question is, take back state houses. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not something that happens overnight. This is the long game. The current success of the voucher cause is a consequence of the extraordinary success of Republicans in capturing state legislatures, particularly after 2010, or in 2010 and onwards. And they still have a larger proportion of state legislatures than the Democrats do. And it's when Republicans are in control that these programs pass. And also it's when Republicans control the presidency that you get an enormous increase in the number of judges at the federal appeals court level, and of course, obviously, in terms of thinking about the Supreme Court, yes. Who are sympathetic to the idea of vouchers and of school choice. And so again, it takes a long time, because but laying the groundwork, I think, for those victories are the things that are ultimately going to turn the tide in all of this. But I hope that doesn't sound too pessimistic for you.
No, I appreciate that. And we are, and all of our volunteers across the state are very good at being tenacious, because we really do feel like public schools, which have made a difference in so many of our lives, truly are a cornerstone of American democracy. They help give opportunity. We need them to be equitable. And we need everybody to have a school down the street that will serve their needs. And so we will keep fighting for that, absolutely. And we always are open to people having conversations with anybody from any perspective, any position. We always want to understand the issues better. We do meet, Save Our Schools meets monthly with other grassroots organizations across the state. So if people are watching this and are interested in participating, we're always happy to include people in that. And Dr. Hackett, we are so appreciative of your time. It's getting late in the day for you over in London. So we really appreciate you helping us understand really what is behind, what's hidden in all of this policy and all of this privatization efforts that are being pushed across our state and in our state legislatures. So I appreciate it very much. If you haven't read Dr. Hackett's book, I really encourage you to read it. It's a fascinating read and beautifully researched. So we really appreciate all the time and effort you put into that. And we appreciate your time today. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.